Welcome to Timeless Love Stories. Tonight's story is an original romantic tale set in colonial America. If you enjoy slow-burn romance, deep emotion, and love stories shaped by history, consider subscribing to the channel. Now, let us begin. Frances learned early that her life would be measured not by inclination, but by expectation. In the household of her upbringing, rank carried obligation, and obligation tolerated little deviation. She was born into an English family of long lineage and diminishing fortune, a combination that demanded vigilance rather than ease. Appearances were preserved with care, routines observed with precision, and every gesture weighed against its potential consequence. From an early age, Frances understood that composure was not merely admired, but required. Her father's death altered the household irrevocably. Authority gave way to anxious calculation, and the future of each child became a matter of urgent consideration. For Frances's younger sisters, youth offered protection. They were presented, admired, and eventually matched. Frances, however, remained. Each passing year rendered her position more conspicuous. Invitations grew fewer. Conversations shifted in tone. What had once been indulgence hardened gradually into judgment. By the time she reached 30, Frances was no longer regarded as unfortunate, but as settled into a state that required explanation. The word was never spoken openly, yet it governed her interactions nonetheless. She bore this condition with discipline rather than protest. Resistance, she had learned, invited scrutiny, and scrutiny rarely altered outcomes. Instead, she cultivated discretion, silence when required, and an interior life shaped by reading and reflection. Books became her refuge and her training. History, philosophy, and political thought offered her a framework through which to understand the forces that shaped individual lives. She read carefully and privately, aware that intellectual ambition in a woman was tolerated only within strict limits. What she learned, she kept largely to herself, sharpening her judgment without seeking recognition. It was therefore with genuine surprise that a proposal arrived from the American colonies. Samuel Hale, a lawyer and landowner in the province of Massachusetts Bay, wrote with clarity and reserve. He made no appeal to sentiment, nor did he disguise the practical nature of his offer. Marriage, as he described it, was an arrangement grounded in mutual obligation and order. He sought a wife capable of managing a household with competence and discretion. For Frances's family, the proposal resolved a difficulty that had lingered too long. The distance involved was regarded not as a drawback, but as an advantage. Preparations began with decisive efficiency. Frances accepted without illusion. She did not expect affection, nor did she demand it. What the marriage offered her was removal from a life increasingly defined by constraint, and the possibility, however limited, of governing her own circumstances. The journey across the Atlantic was long and demanding. Frances experienced it neither as exile nor as escape, but as transition. As England receded, she felt no pang of loss, only a quiet severance, as though a life already concluded were finally being set aside. She arrived in Boston in the autumn of 1773 with composure intact and expectations measured. Samuel met her at the harbor with correct courtesy. He was reserved, deliberate in speech, and notably unsentimental. Their exchange was efficient, their understanding implicit. They married within days, the ceremony modest and unadorned, witnessed by few. Frances entered the union fully aware that it marked not a romantic beginning, but the assumption of a role long denied her. The house into which she was installed was solid and orderly, governed by habits established well before her arrival. Samuel departed early each morning and returned late, his days absorbed by work beyond the domestic sphere. When present, he treated Frances with unfailing courtesy, yet with a distance that left little room for familiarity. Frances accepted this arrangement with the pragmatism of one accustomed to marriages formed by necessity rather than choice. She applied herself to the management of the household with care and precision. The routines of the house settled quickly under her direction, and the servants adjusted to her authority without difficulty. Compared to her former life, her position afforded her autonomy, privacy, and dignity. It was a structure she understood, and one she inhabited with assurance. It was during one such settled afternoon, when Samuel was absent and the house had fallen into its habitual stillness, that Frances entered the library at the rear of the house. The room was cooler than the rest of the house, its atmosphere shaped by paper, wood, and long habits of concentration. Shelves lined the walls from floor to ceiling, not arranged for display but for use, their contents ordered by subject rather than size or appearance. A single window admitted a measured light that fell across a broad desk positioned with deliberate care, as though its owner had long ago determined the precise balance between illumination and focus. Frances paused just inside the doorway, allowing herself a moment to observe before proceeding further. She was not drawn by curiosity alone. The library represented an interior life she had not yet accounted for, a dimension of Samuel that had remained separate from their shared routine. She closed the door quietly and approached the shelves, her hand trailing along their spines as she read the titles. Law occupied much of the room, but it was law in dialogue with other disciplines. History, political theory, and philosophy were interwoven throughout the collection. She recognized authors whose works had circulated discreetly in England, often accompanied by caution, and others whose names had been spoken only in guarded contexts. She selected a volume without particular intent and opened it, intending to read only briefly. She did not. The argument unfolded with a directness that arrested her attention. Authority was examined rather than assumed, obligation weighed rather than declared. The prose demanded engagement rather than acquiescence, and Frances felt, with a quiet sense of recognition, that she had entered a discourse she had long considered privately but rarely encountered so plainly expressed. She read standing at first, then seated, then with the absorption of someone who had found a line of inquiry that spoke directly to questions she had carried for years. She left the library reluctantly, conscious that she had crossed a threshold whose implications she had not yet fully measured. Yet the house resumed its rhythm without disturbance, and Frances returned to her duties with the same outward composure as before. Only her thoughts lingered elsewhere, returning repeatedly to the arguments she had encountered and the man whose mind they reflected. In the days that followed, Frances returned to the library with increasing regularity. At first, her visits were brief and carefully timed, framed by the other responsibilities that governed her day. She selected her books with deliberation, replacing each precisely where she had found it. Gradually, familiarity displaced hesitation. She learned the rhythms of the house well enough to know when her presence would go unnoticed, and she allowed herself longer intervals of reading, positioning a chair near the window where the light was strongest. It was during one such afternoon that she noticed the annotations. Samuel's handwriting filled the margins of many volumes, precise and controlled, yet marked by moments of hesitation where certainty gave way to inquiry. These were not casual notes. They were engagements, arguments carried forward in the margins, questions posed and sometimes left deliberately unresolved. Frances found herself reading not only the printed text, but the conversation unfolding between author and reader, between past and present. The discovery altered her perception of her husband. His reserve no longer appeared as emotional distance, but as concentration. The hours he spent apart from her were not an absence, but an immersion in questions he had not yet resolved. She began to read his notes as carefully as the texts themselves, tracing the evolution of his thought across different works, recognizing patterns of concern and lines of inquiry that returned again and again. Her attention shifted, inevitably, toward the desk at the center of the room. Papers lay arranged with methodical care, their order suggesting frequent use and regular revision. Frances hesitated before approaching. She understood the distinction between shared space and private thought, and she did not cross it lightly. When she did, it was with restraint and deliberation. The papers were not legal drafts. They were reflections, arguments in progress, considerations set down without the constraints of formality. Samuel wrote of liberty as a condition tied to moral agency rather than as a rhetorical device. He examined obedience critically, particularly when demanded without representation or consent, and considered the divergence between law and justice with an attention that acknowledged their frequent separation. Frances read slowly, returning to certain passages, weighing their implications with care. She recognized a mind accustomed to responsibility, one that did not mistake position for certainty. The discovery deepened her understanding of the life she had entered, revealing a dimension of Samuel's character that had not yet found expression within their marriage. She did not touch the papers that day. She restored them carefully and left the room as she had found it. Yet the thoughts they provoked did not recede. That evening, when Samuel returned and they dined together, Frances observed him with renewed attentiveness. Their conversation followed its usual course, confined to household matters and routine observations, yet beneath it lay an awareness she did not yet seek to test. The habit of reading became established. Frances returned to the library daily, sometimes in the morning, sometimes in the afternoon, her time governed by the needs of the house. Over time, familiarity gave way to response. She found herself forming answers to Samuel's questions, anticipating his hesitations, recognizing where his arguments faltered or gained strength. One afternoon, she seated herself at the desk with a blank sheet of paper before her. The decision to write was not impulsive. It followed weeks of reading, of internal debate, of silent engagement. She wrote carefully, framing her thoughts with precision. She did not contradict Samuel for the sake of argument, nor did she echo his conclusions. She examined the same questions from a different angle, drawing upon history, experience, and observation. She placed the pages among his papers, intending to remove them before leaving. She was called away unexpectedly and forgot. Samuel discovered them that evening. He had returned later than usual, the house already settled, the lamps lowered. He entered the library as he often did, closing the door behind him and lighting the lamp upon his desk. As he arranged his papers, his attention was drawn to the unfamiliar hand among them. He lifted the pages and began to read, at first assuming they were an earlier draft he did not immediately recall. That assumption did not persist. The voice on the page was distinct, disciplined, and unmistakably not his own. It neither echoed his arguments nor opposed them for effect. It engaged with them, extended them, and in places redirected them with a precision that demanded respect. Samuel read the pages once without pause, then again more slowly, returning to certain passages as though to test them against his own conclusions. He set the papers down and leaned back, his attention fixed not on the words themselves, but on the implications of their existence. He slept little that night. The following morning, Samuel said little at breakfast. His manner was unchanged, yet Frances sensed the presence of something unspoken. When he asked her to speak with him after dinner, his tone was measured and direct. She agreed without hesitation. They met that evening in the sitting room, the servants withdrawn and the house quiet. Samuel placed the pages upon the table between them. "These were found in the library," he said. "They are written in your hand." "Yes," Frances replied. "You have been reading my books." "I have." "And my notes." "Yes." He did not accuse her, nor did she apologize. Samuel lifted the pages and read a passage aloud, then looked at her. "You do not write to persuade," he said. "You examine." "I have always read in that manner," Frances replied. Writing followed naturally. He considered this, then spoke again. "I do not object," he said. "On the contrary. I find the observations sound, and the questions well placed." Their conversation that night extended well beyond the hour they usually retired. They spoke first of books, then of ideas, and finally of consequence. Frances questioned assumptions Samuel had long held without fully articulating. Samuel challenged her conclusions where they appeared insufficiently tested. There was no defensiveness, only sustained attention. From that evening onward, the structure of their marriage shifted, not abruptly, but perceptibly. Samuel no longer withdrew immediately after supper. Frances wrote openly, her pages left upon the desk without concealment. Their conversations grew more substantial, each advancing understanding rather than repeating it. The proximity that developed between them was not cultivated through habit alone, but through deliberate choice. As weeks passed, their exchanges extended beyond the library. Samuel began to remain in shared rooms in the evenings, bringing his books and correspondence with him. Sometimes he read in silence while Frances worked nearby. At other times, he spoke a thought aloud, not to interrupt her, but to invite consideration. One evening, as they sat together reviewing a passage Samuel had marked earlier, he spoke with a deliberation that suggested careful thought. "You approach these questions as though they concern lived experience rather than theory," he said. "Because they do," Frances replied. "Ideas do not exist apart from those who must live by them." He regarded her steadily. "You have considered the limits of authority before," he said. "Yes," Frances answered. "In forms less visible than these." He did not ask her to explain. The acknowledgement sufficed. Their regard for one another deepened in ways that were not immediately visible, expressed less through gesture than through attention. Samuel listened more carefully. Frances spoke with greater candor. The distance that had once defined their marriage gave way to an ease shaped by mutual respect and intellectual recognition. Neither Frances nor Samuel sought to name it too quickly. What had begun in the library did not remain confined there. The habit of attention they had cultivated through reading and discussion began to shape their shared life in ways both subtle and unmistakable. Samuel no longer treated the evenings as a narrow interval between labor and retreat. He remained at the table after supper, sometimes with a book in hand, sometimes simply seated opposite Frances, observing as she reviewed household accounts or correspondence. Their conversations did not occur every night, nor did they require prompting. When they did unfold, they did so with a naturalness that suggested continuity rather than effort. "You order this house as though you have always lived here," Samuel observed one evening, watching Frances as she arranged a set of papers. "I order it as though it must serve its purpose," she replied. "Familiarity comes later." He smiled faintly at that. "That distinction is evident in your reading as well," he said. "You seek function before attachment." "And you," Frances replied, "seek justification before acceptance." He inclined his head, acknowledging the truth of it. Their exchanges took on this character more often. They spoke not only of books, but of habit, of upbringing, of the unspoken assumptions that shaped behavior long before they were recognized as such. Frances spoke, sparingly at first, of England, not as a place she missed, but as a system she had learned to navigate with care. Samuel listened without interruption, attentive to what was said and to what was deliberately omitted. "You learn to watch closely," he remarked once. "Before speaking." "Yes," Frances answered. "It was necessary." "And now?" "Now it is choice," she said. The acknowledgement altered something between them. Samuel began to look at her not only as an interlocutor, but as a woman shaped by experience rather than circumstance alone. Frances, in turn, found herself observing him with a different attentiveness. She noticed the way his reserve softened when he was engaged, the manner in which his gestures became more deliberate rather than restrained, the ease with which his formality gave way to warmth when he was not required to defend a position. Their physical proximity increased almost without notice. Samuel drew his chair closer at the table, not abruptly, but as though it were the most natural arrangement. Frances did not object. She adjusted her posture rather than retreating, aware of the shared space without feeling compelled to define it. One morning, she entered the library earlier than usual and found Samuel already there. He looked up from his desk as she crossed the threshold, momentarily surprised, then composed. "I did not expect you so early," he said. "I did not expect you here," Frances replied. He gestured toward the window. "The light is better in the mornings," he said. "It sharpens the page." She took the chair opposite him without hesitation. They worked in parallel silence for some time, the quiet, unbroken yet companionable. Frances became aware of the sound of his pen, the rhythm of his breathing, the subtle movements that accompanied concentration. The awareness was not distracting. It was grounding. At one point, Samuel reached across the desk to pass her a book. Their hands met briefly, the contact unremarkable in appearance yet charged in sensation. Neither withdrew at once. When their fingers parted, the absence felt more pronounced than the touch itself. Samuel cleared his throat. "This author," he said, "addresses the question you raised last evening." "I will read it," Frances replied. She did not look at him as she spoke, yet she was acutely aware of his presence, of the shift that had occurred without declaration or intent. That awareness followed them beyond the library. Frances noticed it in the way Samuel paused when passing her in the corridor, allowing space without distance. She felt it when he addressed her by name more frequently, his voice lower, more deliberate. At night, when they retired, the separation of their chambers began to feel less like propriety and more like postponement. Neither spoke of it directly. The first change came not in the night, but in the evening, when Samuel reached for Frances's hand as she rose from the table. The gesture was steady and unadorned, his fingers closing around hers with care rather than claim. "Remain a while," he said. She did. They sat together by the fire, closer than before, their conversation unhurried and grounded in the present rather than in argument. Frances felt the warmth of his body beside hers, the ease of his nearness, and recognized that the desire forming between them was not sudden, but cumulative, shaped by familiarity and trust. "You are not accustomed to being seen," Samuel said quietly. Frances did not look at him. "I am accustomed to being assessed," she replied. "This is different." "How so?" he asked. "There is no calculation in it," she said. "Only attention." He regarded her then, his expression softened by recognition. "That was not my intention," he said. "To calculate." "I know," Frances replied. "That is why I remain." The nights that followed altered their relation gradually. Samuel no longer retreated immediately after their shared time. He lingered at the threshold of her chamber, his presence unmistakable yet restrained. Frances felt the tension not as discomfort, but as anticipation tempered by choice. They continued to read together, to write, to discuss, yet now these activities were interwoven with glances, touches, shared silences that carried meaning without requiring articulation. The desire between them did not demand constant expression. It rested comfortably alongside companionship, deepening through presence rather than pursuit. The evening that changed everything did not announce itself as different from the others. The house had settled into its familiar quiet, the servants withdrawn, the candles lit with their usual restraint. Yet Frances sensed the change before Samuel spoke, before he even crossed the threshold of the room. There was a deliberateness in his presence that distinguished it from habit, a stillness that suggested intention rather than hesitation. He removed his coat and set it aside without haste, then remained standing, his attention fixed upon her. "You are watching me," he said, not lightly, but with awareness. "I am," Frances replied. "Because you have not yet spoken." He acknowledged this with a slight inclination of the head. There are moments, he said, when silence is no longer sufficient. She closed the book she had been holding and placed it aside, giving him her full attention. And this is one of them, she said. Samuel moved closer, not abruptly, but with the same care that had governed all his actions toward her. He stopped a short distance away, close enough that Frances could feel the warmth of him, the steadiness of his breath. You have altered the shape of my days, Samuel said at last, his voice low, measured. I find that I now account for you in decisions that once belonged only to myself. Frances rose, turning to face him. She did not step away. I did not expect, she replied, to be regarded as anything beyond a presence that did not inconvenience. Yet I find myself consulted. Considered. His gaze remained fixed upon her. That was not intention, he said. It was consequence. She inclined her head slightly. Then it is one we share. He lifted his hand, though he did not yet touch her, as though allowing the gesture to exist before completing it. There are forms of attachment, he said, that arrive quietly. They do not announce themselves as necessity, but they persist until absence becomes unthinkable. Frances regarded him steadily. And there are forms of regard, she answered, that begin as recognition, and grow into something that orders one's sense of self. The space between them narrowed without either having consciously closed it. Samuel's hand found her arm, his touch warm and certain, resting there as though it belonged. I have reached a point, he said, where honesty requires a word I did not expect to use so freely. She did not interrupt. I love you, Samuel said, not loudly, but with a firmness that left no doubt as to its meaning. I love the mind I have come to know, the steadiness with which you stand, and the clarity you bring where I once mistook caution for virtue. For a moment, Frances did not respond. When she did, her voice carried neither surprise nor hesitation. I have known it, she said quietly. I have named it to myself more than once, then set the thought aside, believing it premature. But it has remained. I love you, not as refuge, but as choice. The acknowledgement altered the air between them. Samuel's hand moved from her arm to her shoulder, then to her cheek, his thumb resting there with a tenderness that made no demand. Frances leaned into the touch, her composure no longer a guard, but a foundation. Their kiss followed naturally, without urgency, yet without reserve. It deepened quickly, shaped by months of attention and restraint now willingly released. Frances felt the intensity of it not as surrender, but as alignment, her hands finding him with assurance, drawing him closer. The room faded as sensation took precedence over thought. Samuel's hold tightened, not to confine, but to anchor, and Frances answered him fully, her response unambiguous. The passion that took hold of them was profound rather than hurried, an expression of what had been building steadily beneath every conversation. Every glance held a moment too long. They moved together through the house, not toward the library or the dining room, but along the corridor that led past their separate chambers. Samuel paused outside her door, his expression composed, his attention fixed upon her face. I would not cross, he said, without your clear consent. She met his gaze steadily. You have it, she replied. He did not move at once. Instead, he raised her hand and pressed it lightly against his chest, allowing her to feel the steady beat beneath his coat. Then allow me, he said, to proceed with care. Frances inclined her head. That is the only manner in which I would have you, she said. He opened the door and stepped aside, permitting her to enter first. The room was familiar to her, yet altered now by the knowledge that it was no longer hers alone in this moment. Samuel followed and closed the door behind them, not abruptly, but with the same measured attention that had characterized all they had built together. He did not reach for her at once. Instead, he stood before her, removing his vest, setting it carefully aside, his movements deliberate, almost ceremonial in their precision. Frances observed him without haste, aware of her own breath, of the quiet certainty that accompanied this moment. When he did approach, it was not without hunger. He lifted his hand to her cheek, his touch light, exploratory, as though seeking confirmation rather than assuming it. When they moved together at last, it was with certainty and fire, the culmination of desire long acknowledged and no longer delayed. There was nothing tentative in the way they held one another, nothing withheld. Frances felt no loss of self in the intensity of it, only a heightened awareness, a sense of being wholly present and wholly chosen. Later, when the urgency softened and the world returned in quieter form, they remained close, bodies still attuned, breath gradually steadying. Frances rested against him, her hand tracing the familiar line of his arm, grounding herself in the reality of what had been freely given. They lay together in the aftermath, not diminished by what they had shared, but strengthened by it, aware that love, once spoken and answered, had become part of the life they would now carry forward, with all its promise and its risk. The morning arrived without ceremony, its light filtering through the curtains with the same measured calm as any other day. Yet Frances became aware of the difference the moment she stirred. The house was unchanged, the sounds familiar, and still the air itself felt altered, as though something essential had settled into place during the night and now quietly shaped all that followed. Samuel was awake beside her, his presence neither tentative nor possessive. When she turned toward him, he did not speak at once, but regarded her with an ease that had not existed before, as though the act of naming what bound them had simplified rather than complicated their understanding. "You do not appear altered," he observed quietly. "I am not," Frances replied. "Only confirmed." He accepted this without question. They rose together, unhurried, and the ordinary rituals of the morning unfolded with subtle variation. At the breakfast table, Samuel remained longer than usual. Frances poured the tea without thought, their movements aligned through habit already forming. Nothing was announced. Nothing required explanation. Yet beneath this domestic steadiness ran a current of heightened awareness. Frances noticed how Samuel listened more closely, how his attention no longer shifted instinctively toward the day ahead, but remained grounded in the present moment they shared. When he departed, he paused at the door and turned back, a gesture small but deliberate. "I may be late," he said. "I will expect you," Frances replied. The words carried weight beyond their simplicity. As the days progressed, the change within the house became more pronounced, not through disruption, but through coherence. Evenings were no longer divided between absence and retreat. Samuel brought his work into shared spaces, spreading papers upon the table while Frances attended to correspondence or reading nearby. They did not speak constantly. They did not need to. The ease between them permitted silence without distance, proximity without tension. It was during one such evening that Frances first noticed the shift in Samuel's manner when he spoke of his work. His tone, once reflective and exploratory, had taken on an edge of urgency she had not heard before. "There is less patience now," he said, setting aside a letter. "Less willingness to consider delay." "Among whom?" Frances asked. "Among those who once urged caution," he replied. "Positions are being taken as fixed, rather than provisional." She considered this. "And dissent?" she asked. "Is increasingly treated as disloyalty," Samuel said. "Even when it is grounded in principle." The words settled between them with a gravity that distinguished them from earlier discussions. This was no longer a matter of intellectual alignment alone. Frances sensed it immediately. "What is being asked of you," she said, "is no longer simply thought." "No," Samuel replied. "It is being asked whether thought will be followed by action." The following weeks confirmed her apprehension. Samuel's absences lengthened. Letters arrived with greater frequency, their tone sharpened by urgency rather than inquiry. Francis read them when he allowed it, recognizing in their language the narrowing of possibilities. Where once there had been space for deliberation, there was now insistence. At home, they spoke with greater care, not because trust had diminished, but because consequence had increased. Frances found herself weighing her words not out of hesitation, but out of recognition that what was spoken within their walls might soon echo beyond them. One evening, Samuel returned visibly burdened. He removed his coat and remained standing, his posture marked by a tension that Frances recognized at once. "They are watching more closely now," he said. "Those who speak, those who remain silent, those who hesitate." "And you?" Frances asked. "I have not altered my position," he replied. "But that alone is becoming conspicuous." She rose and joined him, placing her hand upon his arm with a steadiness that conveyed neither fear nor reassurance, but presence. "Then we must consider," she said, "what visibility now entails." He met her gaze. "That is what troubles me," he said. "Not for myself alone." She understood without further explanation. "I did not choose you," Frances said quietly, "in order to retreat when choice becomes difficult." He drew her closer, resting his forehead briefly against hers. "I would not have you endangered by my convictions," he said. "And I would not have them diluted for my comfort," she replied. The exchange marked a turning point neither dramatic nor sudden, but decisive. What had once been a shared intellectual endeavor had become a shared exposure. Frances felt it not as fear, but as a sharpening of purpose. Love, she realized, did not soften the stakes. It clarified them. From that point onward, the world beyond their walls pressed closer. Conversations that had once belonged to the realm of theory now carried implications that could not be ignored. Frances remained attentive to the household, yet her awareness extended beyond it, alert to the ways in which public sentiment encroached upon private life. One afternoon, as Samuel prepared to leave, he paused and looked at her with an expression that carried both resolve and concern. "There may come a time," he said, "when discretion will no longer suffice." Frances answered without hesitation. "Then we will meet that time as we have met all others," she said. With clarity. He nodded once, then departed. As the door closed behind him, Frances remained standing, her composure intact, her resolve steady. Love had bound her to Samuel not as refuge, but as commitment. Whatever danger lay ahead would not find her unprepared, nor unwilling to stand within its reach. The quiet of the house returned, but it no longer signified shelter alone. It marked the threshold of a life in which private conviction and public consequence were drawing steadily closer, and from which there would be no return to innocence, only to choice. After this exchange, while reviewing accounts at the desk in the library, Frances paused and allowed her thoughts to settle. She recognized, with a clarity that surprised her by its calm, that she no longer measured her worth by the standards that had once governed her life. The humiliation she had endured, the careful endurance of diminished expectation, no longer defined her. She had moved beyond them not by defiance, but by alignment, by finding a place where her mind and will were not merely tolerated, but engaged. When Samuel joined her later that day, she looked up and spoke without preamble. "Whatever follows," she said, "I will not return to what I was." He did not ask her to explain. "I would not ask you to," he replied. "Nor would I wish it." They stood together in the library, the room that had first revealed them to one another, now fully shared. The books remained where they had always been, the desk still bore the marks of use, yet the space had altered in its meaning. It was no longer a place of indirect discovery alone, but one of mutual resolve. Outside, the air carried the first signs of an approaching change in season. Frances sensed, with the same attentive awareness that had guided her thus far, that a different kind of arrival was imminent, one that would not come quietly, nor be confined to the walls of their home. And as she stood beside Samuel, grounded in the life they had built with deliberation and care, she understood that when it came, she would meet it not as a guest in a borrowed existence, but as a woman who had chosen her place, and would not relinquish it. Letters from England began to arrive more frequently as well. Some were addressed to Samuel, others to Frances herself, written in hand she recognized from another life. She read them carefully, noting the shifts in tone, the questions posed indirectly, the concern that sometimes masked itself as propriety. One letter, in particular, held her attention. It spoke of rumors circulating in London, of colonial unrest, of loyalties questioned. It did not accuse, but it implied her husband's patriotic inclinations, and in its implications, Frances recognized the voice of authority she had known all her life, the one of her own family. She did not show the letter to Samuel at once. Instead, she considered it fully, weighing not its content alone, but its intention. When she did place it before him, she did so without commentary. He read it once, then again. "They expect explanation," he said. "They expect compliance," Frances replied. "Explanation is merely the form it takes." He looked at her. "And you?" "I expect neither," she said. "I am no longer accountable to that gaze." Samuel reached across the table and covered her hand with his own. "Then we are aligned," he said. Their alignment was tested sooner than either had anticipated. News arrived one afternoon, carried not by letter, but by voice, urgent and unadorned. Samuel was summoned to a meeting that could not be delayed. He departed at once, his expression composed, yet intent. Frances watched him go without unease. She returned to the house and set about her tasks with deliberate attention, aware that the hour they had long anticipated was approaching. Whatever form it took, it would not find her unprepared. When Samuel returned late that night, his face bore the mark of decision. "It has been set in motion," he said. She did not ask what he meant. "Then it's time we start moving," she replied. He regarded her for a long moment, then nodded. "Yes," he said. "We proceed." They stood together in the candlelight, not speaking further, each aware that the life they had built, careful and considered, was now bound to events that would extend far beyond their walls. Yet Frances felt no loss of grounding. The certainty she had gained did not depend upon stability of circumstance, but upon clarity of purpose. Whatever lay ahead would demand resolve, judgment, and no small measure of courage. Frances did not doubt that these demands would be made. What she did not doubt, and what steadied her as she met Samuel's gaze, was that she would meet them not as a figure shaped by expectation, but as one who had chosen her place deliberately, and would hold it with the same measured conviction that had guided her from the beginning. The weeks that followed confirmed what Samuel's words had implied. Matters once discussed in measured tones were now acted upon with urgency, and decisions were no longer postponed for the sake of prudence alone. Samuel's name appeared with increasing frequency in correspondence that carried not merely argument, but instruction. He spoke little of these developments unless Frances asked, yet when she did, he answered without evasion, trusting her capacity to grasp both the substance and the consequence of what was unfolding. Their domestic life adapted without disruption. Frances ensured that the household remained orderly and unremarkable, understanding that visibility carried its own risks. Visitors were received with courtesy but without indulgence. Conversations remained careful, and Frances learned to read not only what was said, but what was left deliberately unspoken. The discipline required did not trouble her. It resembled, in form if not in purpose, the social vigilance she had practiced for years, though now it served a cause she had chosen rather than endured. One afternoon, a letter was delivered bearing an English seal she recognized at once. The hand was unmistakable. Her brother's. She did not open it immediately. Instead, she set it aside and continued her work, allowing herself the space to consider what its arrival signified before engaging with its contents. When she did break the seal, the tone was as she had anticipated. It was courteous, authoritative, and laced with concern carefully presented as familial duty. He spoke of rumors reaching England, of alliances formed in the colonies that troubled those who valued order and continuity. He reminded her of her origins, of the obligations that accompanied them, and of the protection that remained available to her should she require it. He suggested, with studied restraint, that her continued residence in Boston might no longer be advisable. Frances read the letter twice, noting not only its arguments, but its assumptions. Her brother wrote as though her presence in the colonies were provisional, as though her marriage, her household, and her chosen life were extensions of a circumstance that could be corrected rather than realities to be respected. She folded the letter carefully and placed it back upon the desk. That evening, she showed it to Samuel. "He believes he is acting in my interest," she said, her tone even. "And is he?" Samuel asked. "He is acting in accordance with his understanding of authority," Frances replied. "Which is not the same thing." Samuel read the letter slowly, then returned it to her. "He will not be satisfied with silence," he said. "No," Frances agreed. "He rarely is, but that is all I can give him now, without compromising you." They spoke of the matter without urgency, yet with clarity. Frances did not express doubt, nor did she seek reassurance. The question of her allegiance had been settled long before the letter's arrival. What concerned her now was not the substance of her brother's objections, but the manner in which he might seek to enforce them. Her concern proved well-founded. Within a fortnight, notice arrived that her brother intended to travel to Boston. The message was brief, its tone confident, as though the outcome were already decided. Frances received it with composure, though she felt the familiar tightening of awareness that accompanied confrontation long anticipated. Samuel did not disguise his reaction. "He intends to remove you," he said. "He intends to assert his authority," Frances replied. "Removal is merely the method." "And your response?" he asked. She met his gaze steadily. "I will receive him," she said. "And I will not leave." The days leading to her brother's arrival were marked by preparation rather than anxiety. Frances ensured that the household was arranged with particular care, not to impress, but to reflect the life she now governed. She did not alter her routines, nor did she withdraw. If anything, she found herself more firmly grounded, conscious that the confrontation ahead required not defense, but clarity. Samuel supported her without intrusion. He did not attempt to speak on her behalf, nor did he offer strategies unasked. His presence, steady and unequivocal, was sufficient. When Frances's brother arrived, he did so with all the assurance of one accustomed to obedience. He was greeted with courtesy and conducted into the sitting room, where Frances awaited him. She rose as he entered, acknowledging him with a measured inclination of the head. "You look well," he said, his gaze appraising rather than affectionate. "I am well," Frances replied. He did not sit at once. Instead, he remained standing, his posture conveying both concern and command. "I will be direct," he said. "This situation cannot continue." Frances gestured toward a chair. "Then you should sit," she replied calmly. "It may take some time to explain why it already has." The words were neither defiant nor conciliatory. They were simply factual, offered by a woman no longer accustomed to seeking permission for the life she led. And as her brother regarded her, perhaps for the first time without the filter of assumption, Frances knew that whatever followed would not be resolved through authority alone, but through the certainty she had long since claimed as her own. The house remained quiet around them, unchanged in its order, yet charged now with the presence of a reckoning that Frances did not fear. She had crossed greater distances than this already, and she did not intend to retreat. Her brother regarded her for a moment longer, as though reassessing a familiar object that no longer behaved as expected. He took the offered chair at last, though the movement carried reluctance rather than concession. "You place yourself in a difficult position," he said. "These colonies are unstable. Associations are forming that will not be tolerated. Your husband's sympathies are already noted." Frances remained standing, her hands loosely folded, her posture composed. "My position," she replied, "is neither recent nor uncertain. It has been considered." He frowned slightly. "Considered by whom?" he asked. "By me," Frances said. "And by my husband." The mention of Samuel shifted the tenor of the room. Her brother glanced briefly toward the door, as though weighing the absence of the man whose presence he clearly anticipated. "You were not sent here to decide such matters," he said. "You were married to be provided for, not to involve yourself in political currents." Frances inclined her head, acknowledging the statement without accepting it. "I was married," she replied, "to form a household. I govern it. I also govern my own judgment." "You forget yourself," he said sharply. "No," Frances answered evenly. "I remember myself." The exchange did not escalate. Frances had long learned that raised voices were rarely necessary when clarity sufficed. She gestured toward the window, beyond which the street lay orderly and unremarkable. "You speak of instability," she continued. "Yet what you fear is not disorder here, but the loss of control elsewhere." Her brother stiffened. "You presume much," he said. "I observe," Frances replied. "It is a habit formed early." He leaned back in his chair, studying her more closely now, as though seeking some sign of hesitation he had always relied upon before. "You will return to England with me," he said. "If not immediately, then soon. It would be unwise to remain once matters progress further." Frances met his gaze directly. "I will not," she said. The refusal was delivered without heat, without appeal. It stood complete in itself. "This is not a request," he said. "Nor is it a decision you are entitled to make," Frances replied. A pause followed, charged not with uncertainty, but with recalibration. Her brother had encountered resistance before, but not of this kind, not from her, and not without visible strain. "You would choose a colonial lawyer over your own family," he said. "I choose my life," Frances answered. "Which now includes both my family here and the principles by which we live." "And if this leads to ruin?" he asked. "Then it will be faced," she replied. "Not avoided by submission." At that moment, the door opened and Samuel entered the room. He acknowledged Frances's brother with courtesy, then took his place beside his wife without assumption or display. The alignment required no announcement. "I trust you are being received appropriately," Samuel said. "I am being contradicted," her brother replied. Samuel inclined his head slightly. "My wife is accustomed to clarity," he said. "It is one of her strengths." Frances did not look at him, yet she felt the steadiness of his presence, the quiet affirmation of her position. "I have advised my sister to leave," her brother continued. "For her own protection." Samuel met his gaze. "My wife requires no protection that diminishes her agency," he said. "Nor will she be removed against her will." The words were firm, measured, and final. Frances's brother rose from his chair, displeasure evident now. "You underestimate the reach of consequences," he said. "On the contrary," Frances replied, turning toward him. "I have measured them carefully." The visit ended without reconciliation. Her brother departed with restrained civility, his assurances of concern unaltered, his expectations unfulfilled. Frances watched him leave without regret. What she felt instead was a settling, the completion of a choice long in formation. That evening, she and Samuel sat together in the library, the familiar surroundings offering continuity rather than refuge. "You spoke plainly," Samuel said. "I have learned the value of doing so," Frances replied. "You understand that this may prompt further pressure." "Yes," she said. "And that it will not alter my position." He regarded her with a mixture of regard and resolve. "I would not have you yield," he said. "Nor would I permit it." She met his gaze. "I would not expect you to," she replied. 2 years later, in 1775, the world beyond their walls could no longer be contained by caution alone. Samuel was chosen as a delegate to the Second Continental Congress, his name carried forward by those who trusted his judgment and his commitment to principles long debated and now demanded. Frances accompanied him without hesitation, her presence neither ornamental nor incidental, but integral to the life they had built together. As they prepared to depart, the house stood as it always had, orderly and composed, yet marked now by the knowledge that its purpose had been fulfilled. Whatever lay ahead would not be shaped by certainty, but by conviction, by the willingness to act upon ideas once confined to books and conversation. Frances stood beside Samuel as they set out, aware that the path before them was uncertain and irrevocable. She felt no longing for what she had left behind. What sustained her now was not origin, but choice, and the understanding that the future they faced would be built not upon inheritance, but upon the principles they shared, and the resolve to live by them together. Thank you for listening to this story. If it stayed with you, you are warmly invited to like the video, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. New timeless love stories await you. Until next time.